Awesome. Hi everyone. Welcome back to the Yin and Yang podcast. We're very honored to have a pioneer in the Asian American journalism sphere and as Asian American activism. We have William G. Wong. Yeah.
Yes. Welcome,
Would
welcome.
welcome. Is it or William? Do you pronounce it G or G or
G, yeah.
G? Okay.
GE.
Um, GEE, right. And the Chinese character is Zhu, which is like yeah. Yeah, great. So yeah,
That's
to
the
get
Mandarin transliteration.
that's the Mandarin translation, but your background is from Hoisan, right? Or
Oh, that's
Taisan
it.
area. Okay.
Yeah. Mhm.
Right. So I think maybe to yeah, it's for this conversation uh so so let me give a little bit of an introduction to our listeners. So William goes by Bill. He recently wrote a book called Sons of Chinatown, and in that book, he gives it's a very expansive look at um, the author's life, Bill's life, as well as kind of the historical and undercurrents of America and America's relationship to Asians, and particularly Chinese immigrants, going from the Chinese Exclusion Act all the way up to recent COVID pandemic, anti-Asian hate. So it's a very expansive book, and that also very personal in a way that it looks at Bill's life and his life as a journalist, his very expansive career in journalism field, from the Wall Street Journal, Oakland Tribune, and all coming from his very strong connection to Oakland Chinatown, a very I would say a close Chinatown to my heart. And coming from the Chinatown roots, going from this, as he describes it in the book, a yellow blanket, and then more to this bigger, shall we say, whiter America, and it's trying to kind of navigating that space up to the present time. So I think yeah, and so we're really lucky to have you. Yeah, Dan, did you want add anything to that introduction or
Oh, no, I mean, I think you covered most of it pretty well.
yeah. All
I would
right.
like to
So
add one thing that
yes,
Sure.
please do.
my father's story is the front of the book, and it's linked to the Chinese Exclusion Act because my father came sort of in the middle of the Chinese Exclusion Act using some fraudulent papers to get in legally. So
Hmm.
how do we define um, legal versus illegal is an interesting issue that is still a subject that is pretty hot today, I think.
Right.
So I just wanted to add that it's not just my memoir, but it's about my father as well.
Right. So I guess that'd be a good place to start. If you could describe who is your father? Who is Mr. Should we call him Mr. G, I guess, or yeah. Uh,
Right. Well, in the book, I call him Pop, but you don't have to
right.
do that. Um, He was born somewhere in the mid 1890s, and we can't establish exactly which birth date because he gave one for the immigration application, and the two other dates were conversions of the Chinese calendar, two different Chinese calendars. So he was about a mid-teenager, maybe 16, 17, when he came through Angel Island as a paper son, um, a term that you and maybe your listening audience may or may not know about much, but I go into great detail in the book about how that was established and why it was established because of the Chinese Exclusion Act had strong restrictions on keeping Chinese laborers out. And it goes way back to the beginnings of the Exclusion Act and all the way
Mhm.
back to the gold rush in the 1849 on. Um, but the paper sun scheme was a way for migrants from the Pearl River Delta, sort of west of Hong Kong, west of Macau, uh, the vast majority of the Chinese migrants who came to America from the gold rush till World War II came from 8 counties in the Pearl River Delta,
Mm.
basically, including some of the villages near Guangzhou, Canton. And then in the counties around Hoishan, Hoiping, Sunwui, Zhongshan, those were the main counties. And Hoishan, Taishan was one of the biggest. At some point, a majority of the migrants in various Chinatowns, mostly on the West Coast, came from Hoishan, Taishan.
Mm.
So, and one of my overall purposes in writing this book was to sort of just put on the record the experiences of one migrant, my father, who came under these interesting circumstances, a paper son, established his business in Oakland after he went to elementary school. He was a student at Lincoln Elementary School in Oakland. And he was already, when he started there in 1912, he was, as I said, in his mid to late teens. And he graduated in 1918, I believe. That's where he learned English. And all that time, he was also working in an herb shop in Oakland Chinatown. Then he returned to China in 1919 and took 4 trips between 1919 and 1933. And he went back to marry, had 2 wives. The first one died after giving birth to his first daughter. He married a second woman from basically the same village nearby, the Yi village. It's called Ailang in the dialect. And she was my future mother. She gave birth to 2 more daughters. So by the time he went in 1933 to bring them to Oakland, he had a wife, 3 daughters. But because of the restrictions of the Chinese Exclusion Act, he could not bring his wife as his wife. For some reason, the law allowed him to bring in a sister. So they pretended that they were brother and sister and not
Mm.
father, not husband and wife. And they were able to again and again through Angel Island, using partially false papers. The testimonials that they needed to give at Angel Island were partially true, partially false, but they were legally admitted. So when she came in November of 1933, shortly thereafter, she became pregnant. All right. So it was scandalous to the outside world that a single Chinese woman on paper
Mm.
would be pregnant. But in fact, everybody in Chinatown knew what the deal was. So what they had to do, and this is a remarkable story, even when I think about it for the 100th time, they had to find somebody to, quote, marry her in America, in Oakland. And I have a copy of the marriage certificate from the Alameda County office, the actual marriage certificate.
Mm.
And they hired a man named Wong Sheng. All right. And that's how I got my last name of Wong. So I'm not really a Wong. And my 3 older sisters who were born in Oakland before me also were Wong. So in my line of siblings, there are 7 of us. 3 daughters born in China with the Gee surname,
Mm.
3 older sisters, and me with the Wong surname. That is to the outside world. In Chinatown, people knew because people in Chinatown had various versions of the dual names, different identities. So, I wanted at least to document in my book my father's immigration, my mother and three older sisters' immigration going through Angel Island. And I go into some detail about the interrogations. And I even go into some detail about the a paper father,
Mm,
guy named G. Bing Fong. Uh, I never knew him. In fact, I didn't know my father's parents at all because he didn't
mm,
talk about it. It was only doing research on this book and listening to my sisters tell family stories. They're older than me. They were closer to my mother in terms of her telling them stories. So a lot of my research on family history is the oral tradition, passing on stories on down generationally. Because on paper, it was very difficult to find the truth in Chinese language documentation. I have a set of English language documents because during the Angel Island immigration process, and Angel Island was open from 1910 to 1940 to
mm.
process and really to enforce the Chinese Exclusion Act. That was the goal.
Right.
So, in order to do that, each person who was detained there for either a few days up to maybe close to 2 years in one or two rare cases, the immigration authorities interviewed them extensively, hundreds of questions about the most mundane, minuscule, silly details, right? So
Right.
I
Like how many, where did someone sleep in the room, or like
correct,
who
right,
lived two stories down? I saw, yeah, yeah, or
exactly
two
right.
houses down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the all these potential immigrants or migrants, whatever term we want to use, had coaching books. And I'm still wondering, because to me, that was Chinatown's way of civil disobedience, protesting the injustice of the Chinese Exclusion Act, but it was done in a quiet way. So some of the Chinatown leaders must have come up with the idea of we need to get around the restrictions by coming up with coaching books to teach the prospective migrants to tell this story that will make them eligible to come in legally. And one of the eligible categories was son of a native, meaning somebody who had been born in America. So my father's paper father said he was born in San Francisco in 1870,
Mm,
went to China with his parents when he was 6 years old, came back in 1890 after the Exclusion Act was enacted by Congress. So somebody at the port there said, no, you cannot come in. You are a subject of China. And the guy said, no, I was born in San Francisco. He hired a sympathetic white lawyer and probably paid him a good sum. And I have the documentation from the National Archives of the case of the federal judge in San Francisco basically said he can come. He can come
mm.
into America. Therefore, he was established legally as the native, and therefore it opened the door to my father and mother as Ji Bing Fong's son and daughter. Sounds
Ah.
it sounds very complicated. I can't simplify it to the degree that it's, but these are the strategies that Chinese immigrants at that time had to engage in order to get to America. And I like going big picture. I like to tell people that America should be proud of the fact that back then and even now, people want to come here to live a better life. It's as simple as that. I am not advocating breaking the law by any means, but to me, there was justification for the way that my father and his contemporaries did it. And otherwise, my three Oakland-born sisters and I would not be here.
Right.
Do you have still like some connections with Wang Sheng, the person who married your mom?
Yeah, not at all, because my theory is he was paid some money to
Yes,
put his name as the husband of my mother,
right,
the single, quote, single woman,
right.
sister of my father.
Yes,
No, and none at all. And I verified it just by talking to my sisters, who then learned from my mother that that was a paper marriage
right,
Right.
completely. And we don't know who he is or where he went. All we know is that on the marriage certificate, he's 42 years old. My mother was in her 20s. Um, we don't know what happened to him, but they never consummated the marriage. He
right.
never lived with her because she was living with our father, her
Yes,
brother.
yes.
All right.
What ab what about your other uncles, so to speak? I know one of them had an altercation with your dad about money issues, but I
Yeah,
mean there were other brothers that were around.
correct. Yeah, this Bing Fong character, the paper father, listed six brothers, six sons,
Sons.
one daughter.
Right,
And my father was number two on the list. The number three was his paper brother, a couple of years younger. Um, they belonged to the same Tong in Oakland Chinatown, because membership in a Tong back then was seen as necessary to do business.
right,
And they were paper brothers, they were Tong members, and they got into a partnership in a Chinatown lottery. And the Chinatown lottery was a very big deal in the late 19th century, early 20th century Chinatowns throughout California. Oakland was one of the sort of the centers of a lottery, illegal business in those days. Um, so my father and his paper brother, the guy just younger than him, same Tong, belonged to a lottery partnership. And my father made I'll call it a gamble on whether to keep the bet of somebody rather than to pass it on to the lottery company. And therefore, if he passed it on to the lottery company, if the bettor won, the lottery company would have to pay. My father decided to keep the bet, didn't pass it on, and that bettor won big.
yes,
One very big, and it wiped out the my father's partners and his own. So our family was on the brinks of poverty, upset my mother a great deal because you know they needed the money.
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
Um, so this partner wasn't told by my father that the my father's little gamble really tanked. And he figured, and this is a little speculation on my part because we don't have a lot of documentation on this, is that my father probably said, "Oh, I can make up the lost funds by selling more tickets in the future
Right.
and accumulate the funds. And at some point, I will have make right with the with my lottery partners." But the other thing that was happening at the same time, some people suspected that my father took some of the Tong's money,
right,
the backers of the lottery. And so there were two things that were happening when my father, he lost his big bet. He was responsible for paying off. And then he was accused of maybe stealing some funds from the Tong to have enough money to feed his family. So as
Mm,
a result, this a lottery brother came down from Marysville, which is another big Chinatown in those days in Northern California, and he wanted my father to help him with an immigration matter. That was
right,
that was his ruse to come down and meet my father. So my father said, yeah, I'll help you. But all the while, I think he said, uh-oh, what's he coming down for?
Right.
Right.
My father did help him, according to, now I get some of this from the Alameda Courts uh, office where they keep criminal records. All right. So I went there. I found the microfiche or a
Yes.
recording of the arraignment and preliminary hearing of the shooter. So I'm reading this, and I said, "Oh my God." Um, so the paper brother, the Tong partner came down and under the ruse of asking my father to help him on an immigration matter. And they finally, at the end of my father helping him out, this guy finally raised the question of where is my money? I
Yes.
want
Mm.
my money back. And then it didn't get very far, and the guy pulls out a gun, shoots my father 4 times. Um, and this is in my family, it's legendary, this story, because for some miracle he survived,
Mm.
right? And my mother, who's back in the kitchen cooking a dinner for this guest, uh, chases after the shooter, uh, runs through Chinatown, loses her slippers, runs by a coffee shop liquor store where a couple of people who know my mother saw her running. They come out chasing after her, chasing after the shooter.
Mm.
So finally, these two guys in this coffee shop catch him, wrestle him down. Just so happens there was an Oakland beat cop walking the streets of Oakland. So he comes and makes the arrest.
Mm.
So it's unbelievable because my father by this time is dearly wounded, goes to the hospital and gets treated, and obviously can't work. Um, but here's another interesting side story on this. Um, I wasn't born yet. This was 1940 of April. I was born in July of 1941.
Right.
So
Mm.
let's do the math. My father was still in recovery. I was born in the early seventh month of 1941. So, as we all know, our gestation is roughly 9 months, right? Human being.
Yes.
And so I did the math and I said, oh my God, my father in his wounded condition they both of them wanted a son so badly
Mhm.
because when they had their sixth daughter in 1938, they were very upset. They didn't cheer her birth. They didn't cheer the births of my older sisters. So they wanted a son. So somewhere around, I guess, October, maybe, a few months after he was shot and still in recovery, he impregnated my mother, right? And
Wow.
then I was born in early July of 1941.
Wow.
Amazing story.
Amazing.
Yes.
Yeah. So he was injured. He had a kidney removed, but
Right.
he wanted that son.
He
He
wanted
had
that. So maybe I should feel good, right? And people tell me, Bill, you were such a spoiled brat. And I says, what did I know? Right.
Right. Yeah.
And I had to work in the family restaurant the way my sisters did.
Yeah.
And in fact, at the restaurant, they were treated better than I was because they're all pretty in some way, kind of sociable. And most of our customers were men. So they would like
Mm.
the girls better than me, and I was a
Right.
little cranky and not terribly good as a waiter. Um, and I didn't get the tips that they got. So
Uh,
tell that story because I didn't consider myself to be a spoiled brat. But there
right.
were there were indications, of course, as I was growing up that my parents favored me in the sense of they started a bank account for me for future college education. And the two sisters of mine who went to Cal before me did not get parental help for
Ah.
the for the fees that were at Cal at those times, which were very, very low. And so they had to basically pay for their own education. So,
Right.
and
So
part of the patriarchy of our culture.
Yeah.
right.
Yes.
I'm the youngest, so I'm the youngest of only three though. And my
Yeah.
brother and sister always tell me like, "Oh, James, you're spoiled. Like dad was so much stricter with us, you know, mom and dad
Yeah,
were so
right.
much stricter with us." Yeah.
Yeah.
I kind of tie back to like place. So before we started recording, we mentioned our backgrounds and our connection to the Bay Area. So I think it might be good to maybe talk a little bit about our connections to the Bay Area. So for myself, my father, as I mentioned, he's part of that generation. He's about almost your age. Uh, he came on a scholarship for as an engineer. So he came as an engineer. So he's part of that. I think Erica Lee, I believe, she wrote about it in her book about Asians coming to America. There's kind of like the Cold War era where like America wants to catch up to the Soviets, right? So they're
Right.
like getting a bunch of intellectuals. So which is a far cry from your immigration story where it's like let's illegally get in, you know, which is
Yeah. Yeah.
and then and so America was like, come on, please, come, all you smart Asians, come in, right? We
Right.
need to
Right.
beat those, we need to beat the Soviets, right? So my father's part of that kind of migration. He came as an engineer, got a PhD eventually, I believe, I want to say mechanical engineering, and then he he worked briefly for like Lockheed, you know, one of those old
Yeah.
institutions, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And my mother came with my sister, who was 1 years old at the time, and both of them are from Taiwan, and
Okay.
this is post Cultural Revolution. So they
Oh,
came in during the military rule of the Kuomintang, or the
yeah.
KMT,
Yeah.
the Kuomintang, I guess is the American translation. Yeah. So
You know,
so
the Hoisan pronunciation is a guok min ong.
Kuoming on. Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay. Anyway,
Similar, yeah.
sorry. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so and then I grew up eventually they found their way to Milpitas, which is in the South Bay, next
Yeah.
to San Jose.
Okay.
And there's a very strong Vietnamese and Filipino community down there. Some Chinese as well, and some of my friends are from their families are from Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Some Hoisan, but mostly I grew up. My generation grew up with a lot of Filipinos, Vietnamese, and I was only maybe of a handful of Taiwanese people, but they were in other areas of the Bay Area. So
Yeah.
I grew up, you know, in the Bay Area, in Milpitas, for all the way through to high school, and I have a very strong affinity for the Bay Area and like kind of like the multi-Asian during that period. I'm in my almost 40 now, but in that period it was like the whites were the minority in my area, which
Yeah.
was and it was so funny because I went to Alviso. I don't know if you know where that is. It's like on the
I've heard of that.
237.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so it's kind of like it's called the dump because like that's where they have a landfill nearby. But I was eating near there one time, and there's the older white guy, and I was eating, and I don't know, for some reason we started chatting. He's like, "Oh yeah, I was here before all the Asians came in." He's like, "Ah." Anyway, so that's my connection to Bay Area. I don't know, Dan, do you want to start? Then and Bill, we'd like to ask you too. Yeah.
My connection to the Bay Area is only like a short time. I was there after graduating undergrad, lived there for 6 years and lived in all different parts except for San Francisco. But I my kung fu teacher is actually still in San Francisco. But
Wow.
yeah, that's pretty much my connection is to San Francisco itself
No, but
or the area.
where did you spend your 6 years in the Bay Area? In San
Um,
Francisco?
Fremont, San Jose, Mountain View, Richmond, and ended up in Novato
Oh my
last 2 years.
Novato. Oh,
Yeah.
and
Novant
the okay,
North, that's in
Marin.
Marin County.
Yes.
Hmm.
The
Yeah.
last Marin County city. There's nothing out there.
Yeah.
There's nothing out there.
Is it still nothing out there? I mean, there's wine, right? Or
Well, no, not in Novato. I mean,
oh,
it's right before you hit Sonoma County, and that's where the wine is.
oh,
Yeah, that's where
gotcha.
the wine is. Yeah. Well,
Yes.
it's fairly simple. I was Oakland Chinatown for,
Hmm.
I estimate, either all or most of the 20 years of my first 20 years were in and around Chinatown, even though my father moved our residence from Chinatown in when I was 7. And we came to at that time, a largely white neighborhood in Oakland near Lake Merritt, which is one of the nice areas of Oakland.
Mm.
Uh, so he bought a bigger house because he had all these people. But we still had the restaurant in Chinatown, and we children worked the restaurant. So we slept at this house 2 miles away, and we came to Chinatown to work. And
Uh,
I continued at Lincoln Elementary, which is the American school that served the Chinatown kids. So that was, and in my book, I call it my Chinatown bubble, with
Right.
mm,
and I've talked to other Chinese Americans who, matter of fact, I met a guy through learning about my book who's from Boston, and his family um, had a restaurant in a white neighborhood in Boston, so they were marginalized in that regards, and he didn't have what he told me my Chinatown bubble because my mindset when I was young was that my universe is Chinatown. And oh, yeah, we'd see some white people, a few black people. They'd come in and eat, or come to Chinatown to buy lottery tickets when when my father was doing that business. Uh, so I had the safety and security of, as you mentioned, I mentioned the word I used is yellow blanket. Safe,
mm,
secure. The kids played the streets, um, because the other Chinatown families all knew one another, had children about our age. So there was literally what's the Hillary Clinton term? It takes a village, and it was that way. So the safety and security of my Chinatown identity were not really challenged until I went to a largely white high school near the home that my father bought in 1948. That's when I had to begin to learn to adapt uh, to a largely white mainstream culture. Uh,
mm,
and in a way, my learning of English has been a benefit to me. I learned that since I've been a professional writer, something must have worked in terms of the use of the English language to earn a living. Um, and I really gradually and quickly lost my facility with Hoishan-wa in the spoken language. I learned a little reading when I went to Chinese school in Chinatown, uh, but I was, not that interested. Even though my sisters and I went, other Chinatown kids went, and we had to learn the language of instruction was Cantonese, which is not Hoisan-wa.
Right.
And as you guys probably know, some of the Chinese dialects are not compatible or not
Yes.
understandable. So you had to go to either a dialect, perhaps Mandarin, that is much more universal, or English, right?
Yeah.
So that's when as I describe in the book, my cultural separation from my father.
mm,
Even though we were together for 20 years of my life until he died, I was 20 when he died. I was physically with him much of the time. He spoke good enough English. Uh, he spoke to us in Hoisan-wa, and we would do a little what we call Chinglish, you know,
mm,
some Hoisan-wa, a little Cantonese, and mostly English.
mm,
Are you
But
still
it was from
involved?
that point on, I went into the mainstream, and I admit to being assimilated, a term that way back in the 1960s among the young Asian American activists was sort of a dirty word. But in writing the book, I wanted to be honest, and I can't avoid that. But I still have, obviously, or maybe it's not so obvious, a real emotional linkage to what I call the Chinatown cultural mindset. Because I call it both a place and a state of mind. And, once people get through my book, they'll see these different layers and connections. And I'm also interested in, although I haven't done a lot of study of Confucian precepts, which is, I guess, sort of a dirty word in China these days. Or maybe not.
Yes.
Is Xi Jinping a student of Confucian? I don't know. But there's a lot of stuff. I mean, I'll just speak for myself. There's a lot of stuff that I don't know about my ancestral homeland because of the lack of language skill, because I can't read the original text, nor would I understand it. I suppose I'm not going to do this at my advanced age, but I could have taken some lessons in Mandarin, the spoken language, or done some more study in the written language. So I'm bad about that, but that's the way it goes.
That's
Mm.
hard. It's hard to pick up a language, any language, and Chinese is like one of the hardest ones to pick up.
No
It's
kidding.
it's very phonetic and contextual. But
Yeah.
are you still involved with the Tongs that your dad was involved with?
No, no.
We're not trying to out you or anything, but
Yeah, no. Well, I was interested in enough, and I read some stuff about the Tongs.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
for our listeners, do you mind giving a brief context of what a tong is? Some people might not understand this term. Yeah.
right. In the Chinatown of my father's day, and even before that, and perhaps even after that, I identify three types of organizations that are predominant. There are the family/clan associations, same name, same
Hmm.
surname.
So
Uh,
G clan or yeah.
yeah, or
So
a
yeah.
combination, the Wong Family Association, which I'm not a Wong really, even though that's my name. Okay, that's confusing enough. Um, there is the regional associations where uh,
Hmm.
your clans came from, whether it's Hoishan or Zhongshan or wherever. Um, and then there are the Tongs. The Tongs are considered in polite language a brotherhood of merchants and perhaps members of smaller clans. And some of their business dealings are legal.
Right.
Some of them are not. And among them that are not are was the illegal gambling, including the lottery, Haigao, even mahjong was maybe considered gambling, and some of the other stuff, maybe drugs, maybe prostitution. Um, but what's interesting is, from what I can find out, there were cross memberships, or some men belonged to all three types of organizations. And then the top organization is what's known as the Chinese Six Companies, or the Chinese Consolidated Benefit Benevolent Association, the CCBA. And
Mm.
I I give the label of Chinatown's City Hall and Chamber of Commerce. So they were the organized leaders of Chinatown with which the white world, the white power establishment dealt. And a subset of that in the Tongs, which ran some of these gambling businesses. They were at the top were the gambling companies. At the mid-level where my father was were the brokers, the retailers, the people who sold tickets. Uh, and at the bottom were all these people who maybe their children, their sons, maybe their daughters were runners, uh, help distribute the tickets, help deliver the results of the draw. But And the white establishment knew about the gambling businesses. Um, but there was a great deal of corruption at the police level. Part of my research was to subscribe for maybe 6 months to the newspaper archives.com or something like that, where you would be, the search engine, you would look for the newspaper you want. So I found the Oakland Tribune, which was part of the newspaper archives from the 1800s through 1970 when I did my research about 10 years ago, 8 years ago. And then in the search engine, now I'm not very tech savvy, but I know how to put a couple of words into the search engine. I put Chinatown lotteries. Boom, almost 300 items came up, meaning there were articles that had Chinese lottery that the Oakland Tribune had done from the late 1800s through the 1950s, basically.
Mm.
So I went the meticulous way of looking at each article,
Wow.
each one. Some of them were very brief. That's when I discovered the corruption of the police department. Very open reporting. 1919, as I relate in the book, was the big year of police corruption, where one former police chief accused a current police chief of taking bribes from Chinatown lottery bosses. Um, and then there were stories of raids. And from one of the descendants of a Chinatown lottery, one or two of them told me, because I was able to find descendants of the lottery sellers, like my father, because they were all dead. But these descendants were in their 70s and 80s when I talked to them 8 or 10 years ago. One of them said, "Oh, a police officer would tell my father that a raid would happen in a day or two."
Mm.
And, so they let him know. So what his father did was he removed the good door to his lottery room, put up a bad door. So when the cops came to batter the door down, they broke a bad door, not a good door. So these are all clever ways that the lottery sellers got around these kind of fake raids. But there was a lot of money exchanged between the white establishment, some politicians, some police bosses, and some beat cops.
So, so
Go
did you
ahead.
ever keep in touch with any of those? So it sounds like you reached out to descendants of, shall we
Right,
say, Tong members or people
right,
who ran the lotteries,
right.
but you yourself, I guess, are no longer associated with that kind of
Right.
world or those associations. Yeah.
Right. In doing my research again, I knew of a Tong boss, the guy who headed up the Tong that my father belonged to, and this guy who shot him. He was in his 90s, but he was known in Chinatown as being a very good go-between between Chinatown and the white power structure. And he had some legal problems with uh, either selling or storing some illegal firecrackers. So
Mm.
there was probably a police record on him. But I decided, and I know his nephews, who are also Chinatown leaders, a little older than me. So I got his phone number, and I called him twice. Very nice guy, perfect English, uh, very sweet. He claimed either not to know my father well, but he may have known my father when he was a teenager.
Right.
So I tried to, in my journalistic, inquisitive way, I tried to get him to tell me whether he knew of my father's shooting,
Mm.
and he would not budge. Again, very sweet, very polite, perfect English, begged off. The only one time I remember going to the Tong, which happened to be just across the street from our family restaurant, um, it was on the second floor. I do have this memory still, and I write about it a little bit in the book, that it was loud, mainly Hoishan-wa, maybe some Cantonese, beautiful rosewood furniture along the walls, a shrine, several mahjong tables, a lot of smoking. Um, I don't remember a lot of women up there, but they may have been. But it was a very lively place. And this was
Mm.
during the New Year period. That was the closest I got to the Tong. But ever since I described my own journey into the American mainstream, that part of Chinatown to me was history and not very close history and secret, mysterious history. And I still to this day can't get any inside information about the
Uh,
Tong. But that almost by definition, they're a secret society.
right, right. I think Dan, you've shared on this podcast before an experience your family member had with the Tong. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah, my uncle was involved in the LA scene, if you will.
Yeah,
And he joined one of those benevolent associations.
yeah.
I don't know the name of which one it was. It wasn't part of our family and not part of our region either. But that's the one where his friends joined, and that's where he wanted to go. But yeah, he some young kid asking for money from the president of the association, um, because the president didn't want to give him the money. He pulled out a knife from the kitchen and he stabbed him.
Oh my
And
God.
my uncle was trying to like stop the whole thing, and then he got stabbed along with the president of the association.
It wasn't a gun, see, right?
Yeah,
Did it
yeah.
survive? Did they survive?
No,
Oh my.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not saying a knife is less lethal, but it's
Fewer,
a gun
fewer.
is more lethal, that's all. Yeah.
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 But
Wow.
yeah, it's definitely a different world. I remembered that my uncle was very nervous because he had to give a speech and he
Yeah.
had to have his younger brother speak for him on his behalf, but he was practicing his speech in order to get accepted into the association.
Wow.
Wow.
Now you
Right.
mentioned the where your ancestral background of your parents are near Shanghai.
Yeah, near Shanghai. It's about an hour outside Shanghai.
Well, again, I don't know enough about whether they call them the triads in
Yes.
Guangdong province,
Yes.
whether it was more localized in Southeast China than in Shanghai or Beijing or Hangzhou or other big Chinese cities way north, because as we know, China is a big country.
Yes. Well,
Mm.
I know that a lot of the triads came from trying to overthrow the Qing government, right?
Ah, okay.
The Heaven and Earth Society and such.
Right.
But uh
Heaven and earth. Yeah, I've heard that.
yeah, I think I could be speaking or misspeaking, but the LA scene, there was a pretty well-known Chinese gang. I wouldn't call them, I don't know if they would be considered triads, but there was a very large gang in the 70s and 80s.
Oh,
And we had some associations with them because of my uncle and his friends. But when you talk to them, it was more or less that's how they survived.
yeah.
Because when you're a Chinese person trying to go to an American school with, other ones, it's almost like it sounds like prison, right? You kind of get grouped together
Gotcha.
and you just like form a group, and then that way there's strength in numbers.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
from there, it just kind of like moved on to other things,
Right.
mostly extortion.
Yeah.
Oh no, no. So yeah, I think you mentioned this in your book as well. There's a Bill. You talk about like the necessity for survival. Like, so in order to survive, for your father to come to America, he had to be a son, paper son, to this Ji Bing Fong,
Right.
and then in and then while here, he had to engage in lottery, illegal gambling at the time.
Right.
Now it seems that all of these are kind of in relation to a very racist white power structure. You mentioned in your book how in Ellis Island on the East Coast, you had all these European Americans, white European immigrants, so white, white skinned European immigrants just coming in droves. I
Right.
think you mentioned like in the millions, right? Whereas you've got in Angel Island these officials questioning people for days, maybe weeks, even maybe even years sometimes. And so, and I don't, and I believe the number was like something in the thousand, hundred thousands, but never in the millions like Ellis Island. So it seems like, yeah. So, and you mentioned this again and again, and also you've gotten some flack for the column that you wrote in the Tribune about highlighting Asian American issues and talking about the discrepancies of like, wait, why is this happening? Why are we talking about this? Why is it always black and white? You know, so I'm kind of curious to hear kind of, and this is maybe I don't know, it's kind of like a broad question, but is talking about how was your experience trying and your because like this kind of like this coming from Chinatown and then going into the high school and then seeing this bigger, wider audience, and how does one navigate the space of like of I guess racist America, shall we say? And is that still the case? This I like you. There's very common occurrences in your book of white power structure, the white mostly white men in many of the spaces that you occupy throughout your career. So I'm kind of curious to hear how does one navigate these spaces, and how did that inform your own identity? Yeah.
Well, that is part of my continuing identity search as I write about throughout the book. Back to my high school experience, at first I tried to keep a low profile. I don't remember any one incident which made me feel inferior or different. It was my own mindset.
Mm.
But I was able, through my English language abilities, to meet some good people in my high school. And as I said, there was only one or two openly racist incidents, which I write about, where me and my Chinese American date had set up a double date with a white couple, more with the guy. He was sort of a member of my same social club I was in high school. Again, at that time, Oakland High was majority white with a cluster of Chinese and other Asian students and a few blacks. There may have been some Latinos, we called them Mexicans in those days, but it was majority white. So on this double date that we had planned, I found out from my guy friend that his girlfriend's mother did not want them to go on a double date with me and my Chinese American date. So that was so seared into my memory. And, you know, at that age, I wasn't super sensitive to that. I didn't think a great deal of it. But when I think back in retrospect, yeah, that was a case of racism. And then one of my best high school friends, whom I write about in the book also, a white guy, also part of the same social club, he remembers the two of us going to the house of our third friend's girlfriend's house, the one who didn't want me to go on a double date.
Mm.
When we went to that house, the girl apparently went upstairs, talked to her mother, and she came back down and basically told me that I couldn't stay. I forgot that incident, but my good friend remembered it to this day, a white guy, and I put that anecdote in the book. So yes, there were times when I felt self-conscious. I felt that I was being treated differently. But I found overall, and then when I went into the journalism world, which at the time, the print journalism world, the newspaper journalism world, were vast majority white, mostly men, but some women. Very few of my background, ethnic background. But I didn't think about that. It was just something that I developed an interest in high school. writing for the school newspaper, writing sports, becoming the editor-in-chief of the yearbook. And I liked doing that. You know, I liked gathering facts, writing it by mimicking some of the newspaper articles I read, not plagiarizing, but simply looking at style and format and stuff like that. It turned out that I was pretty good doing that. I felt comfortable doing it. I liked doing it. But when I went into the newspaper world, my first uh, two or three newspaper jobs where I was either the only minority or the only Asian American, Chinese American. There may have been a black reporter around, vast majority of very talented, good storytellers, uh, middle-aged guys, one or two women. So I simply just as I said, adapted to the ways. I didn't, take offense. And I didn't get any ill treatment that I could detect um, in my first few newspaper jobs. In fact, when I joined the Wall Street Journal in 1970 in Cleveland, the reporting staff was small, maybe 5 or 6 people. The bureau chief was a handsome Texan. Um, no hint of ill treatment because of race. And several of them were very helpful to me to get used to the Wall Street Journal culture. Then when I moved to the San Francisco Bureau, same thing. I was the only non-white reporter of about 5 or 6 men. Uh, then later on, the San Francisco Bureau started integrating some more, brought a couple of white women in, brought a black woman in. So we were much more reflective of so-called diversity. And it was, from those two experiences in my 9 years at the Wall Street Journal, I met some very nice white editors and reporters. I was not in the New York bureau. I might have felt differently there because the New York was the headquarters of the Wall Street Journal. Um, it was when I joined the Oakland Tribune in 1979 when the editor-in-chief was a very prominent African-American journalist by the name of Robert C. Maynard. He had worked at the Washington Post. He had a high profile, and the new owners of the Oakland Tribune installed him as the editor-in-chief. And his goal was to integrate the Oakland Tribune more than it had been. There were, at the time he took over, there were a few minority reporters, maybe even mid-level editors. But again, it was majority white men and some women. When Maynard took over, right before he hired me and other minority journalists, because that was one of his goals, to integrate American newsrooms, and we're talking the late 70s here, right? After the civil rights movement, after affirmative action, after ethnic studies, Asian ethnic studies, started at Cal and San Francisco State, post-civil rights. It's still a very controversial topic to this day in different, sort of different parameters. So that was when I was hired by Maynard in 79, that was my first affirmative action hire. And it didn't bother me. He made me, I was a reporter, meaning the low level, on the hierarchy of newspaper journalism. He made me the business editor, something I hadn't thought about. But he was interested in, as I said, integrating and having some representation. And because of my Wall Street Journal background, he thought I would be a good business editor. And it turns out that I had to learn on the spot to be a leader, right? And it took me a little while. And I go back to my Chinatown days when my father and mother basically, and maybe this is a Confucian thing, said, "You listen to us. We are the elders. You don't talk." That kind of thing. You
Yes.
guys might be familiar with that still,
Yeah.
right? And then the authority figures, your teachers, you don't talk back to them.
Yes.
So somehow when I became a leader in a small department at the Trib and then a larger staff issue, I kind of went back into my head and said, oh man, I have to step out of myself to do what I'm not used to by directing people, telling them what to do, making these hard decisions about what to cover, what not to cover, how it should be treated, and who to send where, that kind of thing. All basic command decisions that need to be made in any organization, I think. It's not just newsrooms. So I learned how to adapt to that too. And whether or not I was a good leader, who knows? But I moved up the chain to close to the top of the newsroom managing editor role. Never got there. But that's when I switched to writing again. Because in my editor's role, I was telling people what to do, reading their stories that they wrote, editing them, placing them on the page, that kind of thing. So I had gotten away from writing. So when I started writing again, I said, wow, I like this part. And eventually I got a regular column, and then I was able to choose subjects, at which time I decided that part of my menu would be writing about my ethnic background, my quote community, both on a personal basis. But I also wanted to get into Chinatown issues because within Oakland Chinatown in those days, there were the business interests and the more social service interests, the more quote liberals versus the more conservatives. And they had either quiet struggles, some open struggles. So I said, let me write about this. So I made some people not so happy with whatever side I took. But back to your point, James, at the beginning, there were some people who were simply not used to reading a non-black, non-white perspective. Because by that time, there were enough black journalists who were giving some voice to their community in however you want to define that term. Almost nobody was doing what I was doing. Almost nobody. There were other Asian reporters who would just do the news, right? Just the facts, ma'am, objective, inverted pyramid. I was beginning to express a point of view. And some of it was like not necessarily controversial. So the feedback that I chose to include in my book, because I got this was pre-digital, pre-internet. People sent letters in. Occasionally they would call in and complain about this or that. But from the letters I got, the ones I cited in the book, there were a couple of black writers who hated what I said and even called Asian some names. But there were enough white writers who were doing the same thing. I also got praise. I mean, it's a little bit of both, right? I'm not saying that people were after me. And in a way, I'm glad I'm not active in digital journalism today, because at the end of my print journalism career at the Tribune, I did a little blogging for the San Francisco Chronicle's website, sfgate.com. So once I posted, and it was all online, a phrase that it was foreign to me at the end of my print journalism career, then people would easily react, right? Comment section. And I made the maybe silly decision to read those comments. And boy, were some of them nasty. Some were really racist. And this was before the onslaught of the different social platforms, because Twitter wasn't around, Facebook wasn't around. It was all just online emailing.
Yes.
Right.
And so I told people how upset I was And a couple of people said to me, maybe even my late wife, she said, Bill, don't read those comments. Don't read those. And this was in the late 90s into the early 2000s. And then I stopped blogging and I just became a freelance writer.
So moving from that space, yeah, journalism back to freelance writing, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on like the landscape of Asian America, I guess. And you even cite in your book this term might not even be the best term. Currently, we're recording, Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. I believe that's the acronym. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's one of them. That's one of them.
that's one of them, right? So, and
Because NH is in part of that too, Native Hawaiians.
oh, Native Hawaiians. Okay. Oh, sorry. It's Native Hawaiian. Sorry. Uh,
But it's not universal. It's just,
right.
a
Yeah.
couple of
And
anyway, yeah.
so yeah, it kind of makes me think about, yeah, what does it mean to be, and this is a very like, you probably get this question a lot. What does it mean to be Asian American, right?
Yeah.
What does that term mean? And are you, and you've received like some of those bad comments like, oh, hey, you're a banana, or are you white on the inside, or you're maybe like, oh, some people are like, oh, you're trying to appropriate black culture. And
Yeah.
it's very interesting because as Asians, a lot of Asians, I think my generation older, we first maybe start making our way into the bigger world of America, maybe by copying what is in the media, which is mainly white and then eventually black culture, right? And then maybe some Hispanic culture. But then as far as our own voice, Asian American voice, what is that? And how do we develop that? So I think, I mean, as myself as a Asian American, uh person who likes to tell stories, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what does it mean to be Asian? Is it Asian in America or Asian American, or is it an American that happens to be Asian?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, what do we do? What's a way that we help our voices and develop this identity, I guess. Yeah, yeah.
Well, these labels are confounding, to be honest with you. And let me go back in history a little bit because in the pre-World War II days, the Asian American population, and it wasn't even called that then, were primarily four Asian ethnic groups, maybe a fifth. Chinese were the largest uh, through the gold rush. Japanese were the second. Filipinos were the third. Koreans were the fourth. And maybe some South Asians, mainly from India. But our numbers were so small. So when the civil rights movement came along and the young activists, intellectuals, who were either at Cal, San Francisco State, other universities around California, got very connected. Many of them got connected to the civil rights movement, led mostly by African Americans with some sympathetic white Americans. So they came up with the idea of strength in numbers again, because our individual numbers were so small that we were relatively powerless even as we were discovering our own history, right? Because in the days that my older sisters went to school, to Cal, there was no racial identity movement at all. And even when I was going to Cal, it was more student power around the civil rights movement, mainly a little bit later, the anti-Vietnam War movement. And then at the same time, there was this third huge American cultural movement, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That all
Mhm.
happened in the 1960s, right? So by the time young people, fresh graduates at Cal, San Francisco State, or wherever, decided to do the Asian American movement. So it made some sense then because the groups, the ethnic groups represented were few in number. And then you mentioned the period after the Chinese Revolution, 1949 in the 1950s, there was some special immigration of maybe the Taiwanese who moved from China to Taiwan in 1949. So that was a smaller group that came over, perhaps like your father did. But in 1965, there was a liberalization of the quota system, meaning each country, I guess country, I'm not sure, had a 20,000 quota, which was much larger in the Asian sense than the 105 during the post-World War II era. And that then really accounted for the large numbers of Latinos from South America, Central America, and Mexico, and from Asia. And then the Vietnam War, the so-called fall of Saigon in 75, brought over a lot of refugees, some immigrants from Southeast Asia, some of whom are ethnic Chinese. So suddenly, the pre-World War II Asian America, much smaller in number, fewer ethnic groups, to this explosion of people of Asian descent, trace their roots to Asia. But when you look at Asia, the old Asian America was mainly East Asia, some Southeast Asia, mainly the Philippines, but not going further west. So how do we define? That's why I have trouble with the label today, Asian American. And I'm not saying it's a bad term. I just don't think it's adequate. Because do we consider everybody who has roots up to Istanbul in Turkey, on the east side of Turkey, to be Asian? Are Arab Americans Asian? Southeast Asia is much more complex. There's Burma, Myanmar. There's Thailand, which doesn't have a huge history, I don't think, of immigration. Philippines does. Vietnam had, and I'm not sure what the pattern is there now. Korea has always had a pattern of outmigration. China apparently still has some, including from my father's old region, but more broadly. And then there are Chinese from the Caribbean. But there is that sort of the middle area of, if you look at a map of this whole area that is considered Asia, stopping at Istanbul or on the west side of it, the east side of Istanbul. I don't know how you define it, but there are so many now in significant numbers. I do wonder how much we have in common other than the fact that either our parents or grandparents or ourselves came from somewhere in this vast landmass, including South Asia, Sri Lanka, you know. So I don't have as I said in the book, I don't have a label that would encompass the commonalities, and we do have some commonalities. During the recent COVID pandemic, there were people who weren't of Chinese descent who were getting hassled and said terrible things about. Could have been a Filipino, could have been a Vietnamese, could have been a Korean. So in that sense, we all look alike. But I think we have significant different American experiences depending upon how long our ethnic group has been here. I know that some Filipinos point out that maybe even in the 1700s, when there were people on ships and galleons who landed somewhere in America, maybe in New Orleans itself. But the first significant numbers came after the gold rush, and it was the
Mm,
Chinese first. And then the Japanese came in larger numbers after the Chinese as kind of substitutes for the Chinese labor that was banned in 1882. And then
mm,
later on, late 19th century into the early 20th century, Filipinos. And the Koreans were somewhere in there. So it is I'm not saying we shouldn't try to work with one another on common issues, but I feel that on the ground, not among the leadership, um, many of us are still into our own thing, um, and may not themselves take the title Asian American either seriously or first.
mm.
Uh, but I love your thoughts because you're at least a generation younger than me, and um, you're, I trust, more part of the digital age than I am. Um, I'm not so set in my ways, but I'm pretty set in my ways. But but you have to look at my book again. I lay it all out there. I try to be as honest and grounded as I can to uh, sort of both meditate and analyze and discuss and express the variations of our belonging and the going back to the big term, who is an American and who should be an American.
Right. I worked briefly at there used to be a Blockbuster near Lake Merritt. Um, I used to work there. It's next to that donut shop. I'm not sure if you know it. Yeah.
Colonial donuts, right?
Colonial Donuts. Yeah, yeah. I used to go to that donut shop a bunch, and there it was so weird. This was like I want to say like 15 plus years ago or whatever. No, even more maybe. But anyways, I just a recent college grad. I wasn't sure what I was doing with my life, and then I was just working part time at Blockbuster, and trying taking some film classes at City College, San Francisco, and yeah, this one lady, I think she looked like she might have been Filipino or something. She was in line, and she looked at me, right? And I was like, okay, yeah, I scanned her stuff. She's like, hey, uh, where are you from, right? But this is from an Asian person, so I didn't take the question that negatively. I was like, oh yeah, Taiwanese American. And she's like, oh, so you're Taiwanese. I was like, oh yeah, yeah, but I grew up here, so I'm also American, right? And she was like, no, you're Taiwanese. I was like,
Oh,
and I was just like, I'm not getting paid enough to argue with customers right now, like, yeah, like and she was just so adamant. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's her own, whatever her own story was. Maybe she felt like she had to be super proud about her Asianness in America. I'm not sure. And I don't know, that conversation stuck with me for a while. I was working mainly with black coworkers, and in Oakland, yeah, that space was mainly black, some Asian stuff, but like, yeah, and that question struck me very strange. Like it made an impression on me. And another question that my father asked me one time when I was younger was like, I think he had some problems with like raising me in America. I don't know, because one time he in frustration he asked me, James, do you want me to raise you as a Taiwanese person or an American, right? As this is high school, maybe it was my rebellious phase, and I was just like, I didn't know how to answer that question, right? So, it's an interesting question, and I feel like now that I'm approaching middle age now, is that I mean, how important is it? And I do think it's important questions, but I do feel like, are you happy with yourself? Are you connected with your are you connected with your culture or not? It's different for each person. And I do feel connected. I feel very proud to rep my roots, and even here living in Japan, I've even come across this too. Like when a teacher would introduce me, they would say, oh, he's Taiwanese, right? right? And I was like, oh, sorry. So I'm actually like, well, technically, I'm Taiwanese American. And she's like, oh, but your roots are Taiwanese, so you're Taiwanese. I'm like, okay, I'm not gonna argue. It's like, right. But it's a far cry for me living and growing up in Taiwan, like my cousins or something like that, who their parent language is Mandarin. Some of them speak a little bit of Taiwanese, the local language there, and their experience is completely different from me growing up in the Bay Area. So I don't know. To your question, that's kind of my feelings on it now. I'd be curious to hear, Dan, do your kids have? I think we talked about this before, but as far as your kids being like, I guess what, Chinese Filipino Americans, like, do they have labels for themselves or not really? Or yeah.
They know that they're Asian American. They can see that part, but I don't think they care. Right now, the it's a different world than what we lived in, right?
How old are they?
They are 9 and 11.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I remember going to school, going through a lot of like labels, whatever, what have you. Asian Americans was like a period of time where that actually was more applicable. But now, when you look at media, you look at movies that are supposed to be set in Japan, like Memoirs of a Geisha, but
Yeah.
they hire Chinese American actors or Chinese actors to portray Japanese people. That doesn't sit right with me anymore. Back then it was like, I guess this is what they can do. These are the only people that they could hire, but it's only because we're limiting ourselves in exploring all these other races and all these other cultural backgrounds and all these other people. There's so many people who out there who could probably portray that character or whatever, that story just as well. So it's kind of hard. I know that, you know, especially in media, Asian American is just like Asian American. If you kind of look the part, doesn't matter what your cultural background is,
Right.
it'll just work. But then when I'm looking at a story that's supposed to be a Chinese person in the story and is cast by a Korean or a Vietnamese, it, I get what they're trying to do, but at the same time, it doesn't always sit well with me.
Yeah.
So I get this idea of like Asian American is not a very adequate label in these days and these times to portray like a huge cultural spectrum of people. So
Right. And for yourself, Bill, your son is half white, half Asian.
Right.
And I'm kind of curious, you end your book, and to wrap up this conversation, I want to be respectful of your time, but like you end this book, that spoiler alert to our listeners, but it's a very touching conversation that you have with your son who's around my age,
Right.
and his thoughts about identity. I was wondering if you want to speak to that, and also, and going back to how we started this conversation, your last name, G. I'd be wondering if you could maybe give us an insight into that conversation you had with your son, and also this last name that you reclaimed back in 2014. Yeah.
Yeah, the I went with my son to China in 2014. I wanted to go back to my father's village, my second trip, just to do research more. Who could I find there? Would they be able to tell me stories? And we were able to do that. But while I was doing that, I was curious about what my son was thinking in the moment, because as you state, he is half of me and half of my wife, uh, my late wife, whose own heritage is split between the German-French border. That's where her father's uh, uh, elders came from, and her mother is Slovakian, um, Middle Europe. So, but she never, in our many years of marriage, I never saw her identify by either her father or her mother. She was just an American girl.
Hmm.
So Sam came along, and we gave him one of these hyphenated names, which were at the time when we were married and that he came into our lives, were the way to go. Um, so when I decided, my wife then said, Bill, when you're going to China, you're not going alone. Sam will go with you. And by that time, he was in his early 30s, I think. So it was great that he was with me. It helped us bond closer. So I asked him one night, Sam, how do you feel? And in the book, or the essence of the interview I did with him, when he basically says, Dad, my identity is with the two of you, meaning me and his mom. He didn't feel necessarily linked closely to his grandfather's place. Because in his teen years, he hung around in Oakland with a wide variety of people from different backgrounds. He had Black friends. He had half Asian friends like him. He had white friends. He had gay friends. He learned martial arts, right? He studied martial arts from the age of 10, which then, as a side note, inspired my late wife to practice martial arts at the age of 49. That's when she started. And
Kaju Kempo, you said it's like a Hawaiian Kempo, I believe, right?
yeah,
Or
Kaju Kenbo. It's a
Kaju Kempo.
Hawaiian grouping of 5 different forms.
Okay, yeah, Dan and I are martial arts nerds,
Karate,
so
Oh, okay.
yeah.
judo,
Have you guys
kempo, and
heard of Kaju
boxing.
Kenbo? I don't know.
Yes.
Oh,
Karate, judo, kempo, and boxing.
okay.
Kaji kempo.
Anyway, an irony obviously is me. I'm of Chinese descent, and even though the martial arts are very popular in Chinese cultural history, but also in Japan and Korea, I'm the only one who doesn't do martial arts. I could, you know, every once in a while, my late wife would have me practice with her because she
Ah,
did the Filipino sticks.
Yes.
mm,
Um, and then anyway, so and the closing anecdote to spoil it a little bit was when he and his Filipina, the American-born Filipino woman of 2 Filipino immigrants, they got married 12 years ago or whatever, had 2 children, my grandchildren, and they didn't tell us anything about anything until the kids were born. And that's when Sam and Michelle are their names, told us that they would take my father's surname, G, for the names of their children, not his hyphenated surname, which was a combination of Joyce's surname and my surname, my fake surname. Very complicated, but I'm
mm.
just trying to indicate that it is maybe the future of America, maybe, despite all the resistance by some white supremacists who still don't like people who are not white or Christian. Is that our future? And is it going to be a future that we can all get along the way Rodney King said in 1992? Uh, I mean, that is really our challenge these days, really. It's
Yes.
Yeah.
um, how do we move outside ourselves, feel comfortable with ourselves, move outside ourselves, and give respect and dignity to our friends, neighbors, associates, uh, without getting into a debate or a food fight.
Right, right.
Yeah. And back to G, I decided to honor my father to legally add the G name as my middle name. But I
Mm.
struggled with that even because I had been professionally writing under William Wong or Bill Wong. If I hadn't had that professional profile, I might have put G last, Wong G, or simply G or G hyphen Wong. So that was my dilemma. I have to live with it. What can I say?
Right.
Yes.
And for those who are actually watching on YouTube, this is the character for G there. Yeah.
Much, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, and in
Yes.
the background, you can see the cover of my book, Sons of China.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's your father and you, or is that
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, that's
In
amazing.
1945, I estimate. I was about 4 years old, and this was in the back booth of our restaurant then. Yeah.
The Great China, yeah.
Great China. Yeah.
I believe what's the Chinese term? I'm trying to look. Zhonghua, the Mandarin. Do you know the Hoisan pronunciation? Let's see. Da Zhonghua,
爱中华. Yeah, in Hoishan-wa, 爱中华.
Ai Zhonghua. Okay.
Yeah. And in
Da
Cantonese,
Zhonghua. Yeah.
in Cantonese is 大中华.
Dai Zhonghua.
Taichung is the Cantonese. Taichung is the Hoisan, and I can't do the Mandarin.
Uh, Da Zhonghua. Yeah.
Okay.
Da. So big
Wow.
China, Great China.
Great China. Great China. Yeah.
There you go. All right, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, Dan, anything else before we move into like our, our routine last two questions or yeah.
Oh, just one last thing.
Yeah.
My wife actually directed something in Berkeley Rep recently called The Far Country. I was wondering, it dealt with
Right.
papers. Yeah, she direct,
Jennifer?
yeah, she directed that in, I forget, like March or whatever it was.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I sent her a book. Has
Oh
she
yeah.
sent that to you?
I don't know. She's in New York right now, so I can't. We, yeah,
I wanted to give Lloyd Sue, the Korean American playwright,
yes,
which was interesting unto itself, and Jennifer Chang,
yes,
right?
yes, yes.
I never met them. I went to the play and they were not in town at the time. Not that I could have met them, I don't know. But I like the fact that they together put on in a dramatic way the Angel Island immigration experience.
Yes.
Ah.
Love that. Yeah. So since my book had just come out and part of it is set at the Angel Island immigration station with all these questions at the interrogation, I wanted to give them copies of my book. So next time you talk to your wife, see if she got the book.
I will. I will definitely ask her about
Because
it.
I asked the Berkeley rep people to send it to them. I didn't necessarily want to invade their privacy to get their postal address.
Right.
Both of them were gone by the time I delivered the book to the Berkeley rep people. So, wow,
Mm.
that's your wife. Okay.
Yeah.
She's into the theater.
Yes. She's directing something right now in New York. So
Oh, something different. Okay.
something different.
Yeah. Wow, that's great.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah, yeah. And yeah, we've said it before, but like, yeah, I'm connected to Dan actually through the wife originally. I studied theater in UC San Diego before,
Oh,
in acting, and she was one of she's like was a graduate student and directed me in a short play scene.
oh,
Yeah, yeah.
great. Yeah.
So great,
Well,
yeah. So hey, small world, yeah. So moving on. What's something so we're called the Yin and Yang podcast, kind of like yin and yang, right?
right.
What's something in your life that you're kind of helps you stay balanced? What's like your day to day? Like, do you have a routine or something? Do you meditate or like what's something that helps you stay balanced these days? Yeah.
I don't do it daily, but I go for a cardio walk
Oh,
in
nice.
my neighborhood. There's up, down, flat through a very nice forested area in a park near me. And I'm in my early 80s, and my walk isn't as sure-footed as it was maybe 10 years ago. But I challenge myself to do that. And I'm told it's good for my health. The
This is in
second
the
thing
Oakland area or Chinatown,
yeah,
near
right,
Chinatown. Okay.
yeah, not
Okay.
near, well, Chinatown is maybe 2, 3 miles away.
Got it.
Um, the other thing I've done, be right before COVID, my wife at the time when she was alive, we would go to a gym and
Hmm.
we learned how to use the machines and free weights, right? So I really like that because before that I was doing some yoga. And while yoga, I'm told, is good for the body, I said my body isn't quite right for yoga, even though I did it for 8 or 10 years and I had a great teacher. I liked my teacher, but I just didn't feel the yoga thing really. So when
Got
I
it.
went to the gym, I really liked learning the machines and learning free weights and other things. COVID hit, didn't go to the gym. So now we happen to have 5 pound weights at home. So every other day in front of the television set when I'm watching a Warriors game or the NBA playoffs or maybe MSNBC, I'm lifting. It's my own routine, but at least I'm doing it. I
Mm.
do weights of varying kinds, and then I do uh, squats, and then I do plank
Oh,
because I
wow.
like to maintain, and I occasionally do push-ups, but from a counter, not the
Right.
real, marine push-ups.
Hey,
Uh,
that's great. That's awesome. Yeah.
so I do those two things to center myself, uh, get a little physical, because all the advice one gets when one becomes old, you got to move. And
Mm.
I agree with that. And I think it's helped me maintain, uh, you know, some life balance.
That's great. So yeah, and then the last question that we'd like to ask our guests is language corner. Yay. So language corner is like a phrase or word in a language, preferably other than English, unless it's like super interesting. We've had some interesting English stuff too. That's particularly interesting and uh, that you're fond of. And I know you use a lot of different languages in your book. It made me think about like my own parents' native language, which is Taiwanese Hokkien, which is it's not Mandarin because as you know from the KMT, that they came in after they lost the civil war and then they went to Taiwan and then imposed Mandarin. So
Yeah.
so I always get this feeling that my father will begrudgingly speak Mandarin sometimes to me, but it's my mom who's like she used to teach Chinese in high school, so Mandarin in high school. And yeah, this is also a sticky thing, calling it Chinese. Well, there's so many different Chinese languages. You can't just call Mandarin Chinese, right? So it made me think about Chinese Hokkien and one phrase like if someone says "dou xia," which means thank you would say, "Oh, mankeki." Mankeki is like, "Oh, 不客气, which is like don't be so polite. No need to be so polite. So men meaning like the negative term, and then keki meaning polite, 客气 in Mandarin. So men keki. So that's one phrase. Another phrase I'd like to share is like yen dao, which is like oh you're looking looking handsome in dao. So like as a kid when I would go to Taiwan, they're like oh in dao like cute kid, handsome kid. And then one another phrase, and this is my last one, was "bogan kwan." Bogan kwan means like 不一样, means not the same, 不一样. So "bogan kwan." So those are some Taiwanese phrases that I would hear growing up in my household with here and there. And then there's a lot more, but yeah, those are some three that stuck out to me as I coming into this podcast that I thought about. Yeah. So I'm curious to hear Dan or Bill. Do you want to share any phrases that you've come across? Yeah.
Bill?
Let me share a Hoishan-wa phrase that is fairly simple. It's "ai ya," "ai ya," which is the Hoisan equivalent of OMG. Oh my God. Oh, so that's the phrase I like to use. So, and
I
I,
yeah. Yeah.
when I, sometimes when I text my sisters who know that phrase, I will, to express, oh, oh my God, but in Hoisanwa,
Ah.
A-I-Y-A, Aiwa, Aiya.
Uh, yeah. We use that in Taiwan
Ah,
too. Yeah.
but the intonation has to be there.
I
Aiya.
yeah. I have you ever heard of Ayo? That's a different. It's a Taiwanese version, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we have aya, and we also have ayo. And but it's like depending on the context, one is a little bit more used than the other. I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah.
So mine is it's kind of a slang version of omoshiroi. Omoshiroi is very interesting in Japanese. Oh, that's very interesting. You say omoshiroi. But
Mm.
I think the Westerners in Kansai they say omoroi. They cut out the she part. They go omoroi.
Wow.
Omoroi. Oh.
Yeah.
Did you use that in Japan when you were there, or?
No, no, no. I used to work in a Japanese company, and this one guy who was from the western part of Japan, he was like, "Omoroi," and I was like, "What?"
You mean omoshiroi, right? Or no, 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 omoroi. Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
cool.
well, that's it.
Well, that's it. Well, Bill, this was a great conversation. Hopefully, maybe we can do it again sometime. I'd love to hear your thoughts more on also the current issues too. We didn't even get to like the pandemic or Trump or any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that's like a much longer conversation, but we really appreciate your time and thanks for speaking with us.
Thank you
No, I'm
much.
I'm honored to be on your show, and at some point I'll find the link so I can share it, right?
Yes,
Um,
yeah. So we'll be on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and also on our website. You can download this episode. Be sure to like and subscribe. I'll do all of that social media stuff,
yeah.
and but also please check out Bill's book, Sons of Chinatown, which is out now. Bill, what's the best way people can reach you? Find out buy your book, find out more about your work.
Yeah, the my website is William G Wong, all lowercase, williamgwong.com. And I'm not terribly good at updating it, but I'm going to ask my son to help me over the next few weeks. When I get the link from you guys. I'm doing another podcast later this week with the National Archives.
Oh,
Oh,
cool.
amazing.
Yeah, where I'm going to go over some of the details of the documents I got from the National Archives that help tell my father's story.
Amazing. Okay,
When I
awesome.
get both of them, I have my son put them on my website, and but that's the best way to reach me, and I guess so.
Cool.
Well,
Check
thank you
out the
very
Okay.
much,
website.
Bill.
Yeah, thank you so much,
Thank you.
Bill. All right, signing up. This is James signing off, and
This is Dan
we'll see.
signing off.
And then
Thank you.
Bill, thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.